Picture a boy, just a teenager, suddenly forced into the world of Emperor Nero, a world of jewels, crowds, and constant fear. Nero himself had taken power at just 16, the last ruler of a legendary dynasty, and his reign would become a byword for both promise and cruelty. But nobody expected the lengths he would go to fill the emptiness left by his wife's death. How far could one man go to rewrite the past and control the people around him? The answer was enough to astonish Rome's elite and leave the entire city whispering. Today, we're exposing the layers of manipulation, obsession, and cruelty that transformed Sporus into Nero's unwilling empress. And it all started with a public spectacle that no one in Rome could quite believe. It's AD 67, and Rome is buzzing with a different kind of energy. The forum is packed, people pressed shoulder to shoulder, all eyes fixed on the cleared path. Normally, this place is a blur of business, gossip, and the usual jostling for a good deal, but today, nobody cares about the price of fish or what the senators are arguing about. The talk on everyone's lips is about the spectacle that's about to unfold, something so strange it's already outpaced the city's rumor mill. People angle for a better view, some climbing onto steps or market stalls, while soldiers shove anyone who gets too bold back into the crowd. The sense of anticipation is sharp. Everyone knows something big is coming, but nobody's sure exactly what. Rome isn't easily impressed. This is a city that's seen generals parade their spoils, gladiators fight to the death, and emperors flaunt their power with every trick they can imagine. But what's coming down the street now isn't just another parade. Instead of a regal empress or a conquering hero, the crowd spots a teenage boy, maybe 15, maybe a bit older, dressed in a silk bridal gown, weighed down with jewelry that once belonged to a real empress. His hair is styled to perfection, echoing the statues of goddesses that line the city. The message is impossible to miss. This is supposed to be someone of importance, someone you don't dare mock. But the effect is unsettling, and even those at the back sense something deeply off. The reaction isn't cheers or applause. It's a collective sharp intake of breath. Whispers race through the crowd. "That's not a woman," someone mutters. "Is that really the emperor's wife?" another asks, voice barely above a whisper. The bolder ones say, "That's Sporus, the palace boy. Looks just like Poppaea, doesn't he?" But nobody says it too loud. In Rome, you learn quickly that survival means knowing when to keep your mouth shut, especially when the emperor is involved. Nero leads the parade, making sure every important Roman and every foreign ambassador is watching. He grins, soaking in the attention, as if daring people to look away. Nero has always cared more about appearances than reality. This is the man who built a palace filled with gold and staged plays where he was always the star. For him, life is a performance, and the people of Rome are the audience he needs to win over, or at least control. If he can control what they see, maybe he can control what they believe. But today, belief is stretched to the breaking point. The air is thick with anxiety. Romans are used to scandal. They joke about their leaders, complain about taxes, and swap gossip at every chance. But this is different. This isn't just another affair or a political marriage. This is something that shakes the foundations of what Rome thinks is possible. The crowd is silent, tense, as if waiting for a signal about how to react. Even the city's sharpest satirists, like Suetonius, later wrote that Nero's actions went beyond all bounds of decency. That's a strong statement from someone who'd seen emperors do just about everything. Tacitus, who rarely showed surprise, said the public was stupefied, not quite afraid, but not amused either. There's a nervous edge in the crowd. Mothers pull their children close. Shopkeepers suddenly remember to close up early. Senators make a show of looking bored, but nobody's buying it. Everyone can feel the pressure to pretend this is normal, to play along with the emperor's latest fantasy. In Rome, you don't outlive emperors by being the first to point out their mistakes. The parade winds on, past temples and statues older than Nero himself. But underneath the pageantry, there's a sense that something fundamental has changed. Nero isn't just breaking the rules, he's burning them. After this, there's no going back. The image of Sporus, painted and paraded as an empress, will haunt Rome's memory for years. Old women will whisper about the boy bride for decades. Every festival, every imperial appearance, the story will come up again, a reminder that the emperor can do whatever he wants, no matter how bizarre. People in the crowd are left with questions they don't dare voice. What drives a man to put on a show like this? What emptiness is he trying to fill? And if the emperor can do this in public, what else is he capable of behind closed doors? The city stands silent, uneasy, and a little more afraid than before. What's even stranger is that not so long ago, Nero was the golden boy of Rome, the ruler everyone hoped would bring a better era. But something had changed. The parade wasn't just a spectacle, it was a warning sign. Rome was starting to realize that the emperor they once cheered for was turning into someone they barely recognized. Nero's story starts with a lot of hope and just as much pressure. When he became emperor in AD 54 at age 16, Rome was ready for a change. The city had spent years under older, stricter rulers, and the idea of a teenage emperor actually felt refreshing to most people. Nero didn't storm in with threats or wild promises. He tried to win people over. He cut taxes, handed out more public games, and made a big show of respecting the Senate. His first 5 years, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, were relatively calm, with tax cuts and games. If you were a regular person, life actually got a little easier, and the mood in Rome lightened up. A big reason things didn't immediately go off the rails was Nero's team of advisors. He leaned hard on Seneca, his tutor, and Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard. These two acted like guardrails, keeping Nero's worst impulses in check and steering him away from disaster. For a while it worked. Rome enjoyed a rare stretch of peace and stability. If you walked through the forum, you'd catch people talking about how the young emperor might finally bring back the good old days. It was almost enough to make you forget. He was just a teenager with a dangerous amount of power. But power changes people, and Nero was no exception. As soon as he started feeling more confident, and maybe a little too sure of himself, the cracks began to show. He became obsessed with the idea that everyone around him was plotting something. Even his own family wasn't safe. The most chilling moment came early. His adopted brother Britannicus, a possible rival, dropped dead at a banquet, poisoned in full view of the guests. Nero didn't bother to hide it. Word spread fast. Suddenly, everyone understood that being close to the emperor was risky business. Once Nero realized he could get away with murder, his paranoia only grew. He started seeing enemies everywhere. If you were in his inner circle, you learned to watch your back. Treason trials became a regular feature of life in Rome. People kept their opinions to themselves, or risked a late-night visit from the emperor's informants. It didn't take long for Nero to start purging anyone he suspected of disloyalty, rivals, politicians, even people who just looked at him the wrong way. Seneca and Burrus tried to hold things together, but nothing lasts forever. Burrus died, and Seneca, tired of trying to reason with a suspicious emperor, quietly stepped aside. That left Nero surrounded by flatterers, people who told him exactly what he wanted to hear. Tigellinus, his new top advisor, was especially good at this. If Nero wanted something, Tigellinus made it happen, no matter how strange or cruel. The palace became a place where nobody dared to speak the truth, and everyone learned to fake enthusiasm for whatever Nero was into that week. The atmosphere at court turned tense. People vanished without warning. Executions happened quietly, and senators started avoiding eye contact in public. The safest move was to act like everything was fine. Laugh at Nero's jokes, and clap for his latest performance, even if you hated every minute. Nero demanded total devotion, not just obedience. The line between reality and performance blurred, with everyone pretending to love the emperor's new hobbies. Nero's interests shifted from ruling Rome to chasing applause. He wanted to be seen as a superstar, not just an emperor. He wrote songs, acted in plays, and forced Rome's most important people to sit through his shows. Senators who used to debate laws now found themselves faking smiles while Nero sang off-key. If anyone looked bored, Nero noticed, and he had a long memory. The emperor's focus on performance meant that real problems got ignored. Hungry crowds and angry senators didn't matter as much as the next standing ovation. Then came the disasters. In AD 64, the Great Fire ripped through Rome. Rumors flew about Nero's role. Some said he watched the city burn while playing music. Others insisted he rushed to help. What nobody could deny was that, after the fire, Nero built himself a golden palace right on the ruins. While ordinary people searched for missing family members, Nero threw lavish parties in his new home. When the city demanded someone to blame, he picked the Christians, launching a wave of brutal punishments that even hardened Romans found disturbing. Nero's temper became legendary. He was known for sudden rages, smashing furniture, storming out of meetings, or canceling festivals if someone laughed at the wrong time. Life near the emperor was a constant guessing game. One day you might be in his good graces, the next you could disappear for saying the wrong thing. The jokes and gossip that used to fill Rome's streets faded away. People learned to keep their heads down and hope Nero's attention stayed somewhere else. All the hope that marked the start of Nero's reign had vanished. The emperor who once promised a new era now ruled by fear and whim. But underneath the paranoia and violence, something else was driving him, a need for love and approval that no amount of power could satisfy. That's when a new figure appeared in Nero's life, someone who would change everything and push the emperor to even greater extremes. Poppaea Sabina was born in Pompeii in AD 30, right into the heart of Roman high society. Her father, Titus Aulus, tried to climb the political ladder but ended up executed for his connections with the wrong people, namely Lucius Sejanus, who wasn't exactly the safest ally in Rome. Her mother, Poppaea Sabina the Elder was famous for her beauty and her reputation for scandal, which meant Poppaea grew up knowing that fortunes could flip overnight and that being noticed was both a blessing and a curse. She inherited not just her mother's looks, but also property and a brick factory, rare assets for a woman in that world. In a city obsessed with lineage and gossip, Poppaea learned early that making the right friends was just as important as being born into the right family. Poppaea didn't waste time blending into the background. While most Roman women were expected to stay quiet and let the men handle politics, she did the opposite. She married Rufus Crispinus, the Praetorian prefect, which gave her a front-row seat to everything happening at the top. That marriage didn't last, but it was a smart move. Her next husband was Otho, a close friend of Nero's. If you're keeping track, that's 2 marriages to men who could open doors in Rome. Historians say the marriage to Otho was less about love and more about strategy. Poppaea wanted to get closer to the emperor, and Otho was her ticket in. Once she had Nero's attention, Otho was shipped off to govern Lusitania, and Poppaea moved up to the main stage. Poppaea's arrival at court set off alarms everywhere. She wasn't just another pretty face. She was ambitious and knew how to use every advantage. People noticed how quickly she became Nero's favorite. He showered her with gifts, jewels, and estates. He even had portraits made of her, the kind reserved for the imperial family. Ancient writers, especially Tacitus, didn't hold back with their opinions. He claimed Poppaea was guided by advantage, not passion, and that she offered her favors wherever they'd get her the most. Whether that's fair or not, it's clear she was skilled at reading the room and playing her cards right. She encouraged Nero to divorce his first wife, Octavia, and when he did, it sent shockwaves through Rome. Octavia, once the Empress, was exiled and eventually executed. Poppaea took her place, and suddenly the palace had a new power couple. This wasn't just another political marriage. For Nero, it was obsession. He wanted Poppaea by his side, and he wanted everyone to know it. At night, the palace would be filled with new decorations, parties, and portraits, all for her. Poppaea became a patron of poets and musicians, turning the court into a center for art and entertainment. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind, even if it meant disagreeing with Nero in front of others. Most people would have been terrified to challenge the emperor, but Poppaea managed to do it and survive longer than anyone expected. Still, living with Nero was never simple. He was unstable, and the palace was always teetering on the edge of chaos. Poppaea's influence was strong, but it also made her a target for jealousy and rumors. Stories spread about her manipulating Nero, about her ambitions, and about her willingness to do whatever it took to stay on top. Some said she was cold and calculating. Others saw her as the only person who could keep Nero in check. Either way, she was always at the center of every major decision and every scandal. Her death in 65 AD is still debated. Officially, Poppaea died from complications during childbirth while pregnant with Nero's child. But the rumors started immediately. Tacitus, never one to pass up a good scandal, wrote that Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked her while she was pregnant, leading to her death. There was no investigation, just a palace that suddenly got a lot quieter. Some believed it was a tragic accident. Others whispered that it was cold-blooded murder. What everyone agreed on was that her death left a hole in Nero's life that nothing could fill. Nero reacted with over-the-top grief. He organized a massive public funeral, gave speeches praising Poppaea's beauty and virtues, and had her deified so that nobody could ever forget her. He filled the palace with golden statues and portraits, redecorated rooms to her taste, and even built a temple in her honor. Tacitus, always skeptical, noted that Nero's praise of Poppaea's motherhood and virtues was more about image than reality, but it didn't matter. The city got the message that Poppaea was untouchable, even in death. But grief didn't settle Nero down. It made him restless, desperate to fill the emptiness left behind. He couldn't let go of the image of Poppaea, and he started looking for someone, anyone, who could bring her back, at least in his own mind. The palace staff noticed the change. People whispered about who might be next to catch the emperor's eye, and the tension grew with every passing day. In a world where even the most powerful could vanish overnight, everyone in the palace learned to keep their head down and avoid attention. But for one young servant, that would soon become impossible. Sporus' story is not about a palace servant who got lucky. It's about a boy, barely 14 or 15, whose whole world was shaped by the whims of the most unpredictable man in Rome. Born into slavery inside the imperial household, Sporus had a life that looked privileged on the surface. He learned to read and write, picked up numbers, and was trained for administrative work. Compared to most slaves, that was a golden ticket. But in reality, it just meant he was always under the emperor's gaze. When he was officially manumitted, it wasn't a ticket to freedom, it was just a change in paperwork. He still depended on Nero for everything. His safety, his food, his very right to exist in the palace. For most palace kids, the goal was to blend in, keep your head down, and hope you never caught the wrong kind of attention. Sporus didn't get that choice. He had a face that made people stop and stare. A face that, by a twist of fate, looked eerily like Poppaea Sabina, Nero's dead wife. The resemblance was so close that it spooked even the seasoned palace staff. Sharp cheekbones, pale skin, and a haunted look in his eyes. These weren't just features. They were a curse. When Nero saw Sporus, he didn't see a freedman. He saw a chance to bring Poppaea back from the dead. Nero's obsession grew with every passing day. The emperor's grief twisted into something strange, and Sporus became the focus of it all. At first, it might have looked like special treatment, new clothes, better food, private tutors, and gifts that would make any other freedman jealous. But the palace wasn't fooled. Everyone could see that Sporus was being singled out, and in Nero's Rome, that was never good news. Staff whispered in corners, careful not to be overheard. They noticed the guards who started following Sporus, the perfume left in his rooms, and the way Nero's gaze never drifted far from him. You can imagine the fear that came with this attention. Sporus couldn't just walk away, and nobody could protect him. The emperor's word was law, and everyone else was just trying to survive. Some older freedmen muttered warnings. Nothing good ever happened to those who caught the emperor's eye. The palace was full of stories about servants who vanished overnight, and Sporus knew that saying no to Nero wasn't an option. He had to play along, even as he felt his world closing in. The first thing to go was his name. He stopped being whoever he'd been before and became Sporus, a word that means seed or semen. Not exactly a name you'd want on your tombstone. It was a label meant to humiliate, a reminder to everyone that Sporus's body was no longer his own. Ancient writers point out that the nickname was all about power. It signaled that Sporus would never be allowed to have children or a legacy of his own. Every time someone used that name, it was a reminder of who held all the cards. Being a freedman in the imperial palace was supposed to mean a step up, but for Sporus, it was just a different kind of prison. He was surrounded by luxury, but every privilege depended on Nero's mood. He couldn't protest or even show discomfort. The palace staff avoided his eyes, and old friends drifted away, afraid of being caught in the emperor's latest obsession. New, expensive robes appeared in his quarters, and the door started locking at night. Every day, Sporus saw less of himself in the mirror and more of the person Nero wanted him to become. What happened to Sporus wasn't about romance or even desire. It was about control. Nero wanted to erase Sporus's identity and replace it with his own fantasy. The palace became a stage, and Sporus was forced into the lead role. Every meal, every lesson, every gesture was scripted by someone else. He learned to survive by blending in, accepting whatever changes came, and hoping that the emperor's interest would eventually fade. But the changes kept coming, each one more drastic than the last. The palace gossips who once whispered about Sporus now fell silent, sensing that something worse was on the horizon. Sporus was trapped in a situation where the only way to survive was to become exactly what Nero demanded, no matter how much it cost him. The next step in Nero's obsession would push Sporus beyond anything he could have imagined, forcing him to give up not just his name, but every part of himself that made him who he was. What followed was not just another imperial whim. It was a decision that would strip Sporus of his identity, his body, and any hope of returning to a normal life. The transformation was about to begin, and nothing in the palace would ever be the same. Nero's next move wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. Under imperial orders, Sporus was forced to undergo castration, a procedure that in ancient Rome was as dangerous as it was dehumanizing. Roman surgeons didn't have modern tools or anesthesia. They used crude knives and little more than wine or poppy juice to dull the pain. Infection and blood loss were common, and many who went through it didn't survive. But Nero wasn't interested in Sporus's well-being. He wanted to erase Sporus's identity and turn him into a living replica of Poppaea Sabina, his late wife. The surgery took place right inside the palace, a show of power and control. There was no medical reason, just the emperor's obsession with recreating the past. Surviving the procedure was only the beginning. Sporus's recovery was watched closely, not out of care, but to ensure he could be shaped into Nero's vision. Each day brought new demands. The court staff, motivated by fear or ambition, carried out Nero's orders without question. Some did it to avoid punishment, others hoping to win favor. Sporus was given lessons in how to walk, speak, and act like Poppaea. Tutors drilled him on feminine mannerisms, from the way he held his hands to the tilt of his head. Makeup artists taught him how to apply rouge and powder, sometimes using lead-based cosmetics that were toxic in their own right. Hairdressers styled his hair to match the late Empress, pinning it up and adding ornaments. The jewelry and gowns he wore had belonged to Poppaea herself, making the transformation even more unsettling. The process didn't stop at appearances. Sporus's old name was stripped away. Nero insisted everyone call him Sabina, a constant reminder that his real self no longer mattered. In public, the pressure to perform was relentless. Sporus was paraded in front of the court, compared to Poppaea at every turn, and expected to embody her memory for Nero's benefit. The humiliation was daily and deliberate. It was about showing everyone, servants, nobles, and foreign guests, that Nero's will was absolute, and that no one, not even a person's own body, was safe from his demands. The court played along, each person finding their own reason to participate. Some were afraid, knowing that showing hesitation or disgust could mean exile or worse. Others saw opportunity, hoping that helping with Sporus's transformation might earn them a promotion or special favor. In Nero's palace, ambition didn't stop for tragedy. The staff became part of the machinery that erased Sporus's identity, turning him into a project instead of a person. Then came the preparations for a spectacle that would stun even Rome's jaded elite: Nero's wedding to Sporus. The palace was transformed for the event. Silks, flowers, and musicians filled the halls. Sporus, now called Sabina, was dressed in Poppaea's finest gowns and jewelry. Invitations went out to Rome's most important families, some of whom feigned excitement, while others could barely hide their shock. The whole event was staged with the kind of attention to detail you'd expect from an emperor who saw life as one long performance. The wedding itself was as surreal as it was unsettling. Nero played the role of groom, placing rings on Sporus's trembling hand and declaring him his wife. Gifts meant for an empress were heaped on the young man. The guests, senators, nobles, and foreign dignitaries, sat in silence, unsure how to react. Ancient writers like Suetonius and Dio Cassius described it as a grotesque parody of marriage, proof that Nero had lost touch with Roman values and basic decency. Even in a city famous for its scandals, this was something new. After the wedding, the performance never stopped. Sporus was expected to fill the role of empress in every setting: at banquets, in public ceremonies, and behind closed doors. He sat beside Nero at dinners, attended public events dressed in imperial finery, and played the part of a devoted wife. Every move was watched, every word was measured. The risks were high. A single mistake could mean punishment or worse. Sporus lived surrounded by luxury, but every moment was a test of survival. The palace itself became a place where luxury and danger mixed in equal measure. Sporus had everything anyone in Rome could want, except for freedom or the right to be himself. He became a living reminder of Nero's obsession, a daily symbol of what unchecked power could do. And as the days passed, it became clear that this new life was as much a trap as any prison cell, with Sporus forced to play a role he never chose, in front of an audience that knew exactly what was at stake. If you ever wanted to see a textbook case of luxury as a trap, this was it. After the wedding, Sporus's life looked like something out of a storybook. On the surface, anyway. He moved into palace rooms that would make most senators jealous. Painted walls, silk bedding, a staff ready to jump at every request. He had his own chariot, horses, and a wardrobe that could pass for royal. The imperial treasury covered everything, and his allowance was more than most Roman families would ever see. But all this privilege came with a rule that couldn't be ignored. Sporus was expected to live every moment as Sabina, the Empress reborn, and there was no room for mistakes. Every part of Sporus's day was about maintaining the illusion. He woke up in rooms decorated to look like Poppaea's old apartments, with the same perfumes and flowers she liked. Portraits of Poppaea lined the walls, and mirrors were placed so that Sporus would always see the version of himself that Nero demanded. The staff didn't just serve him. They corrected his posture, fixed his makeup, and made sure every gesture matched the late Empress. Even at meals, Sporus sat beside Nero, acting out the role of a devoted wife, with every bite and every glance part of the ongoing performance. Nero made it official. Sporus was to be called Sabina, echoing Poppaea's name, and everyone in the palace followed suit. This wasn't just a nickname. It was a daily reminder that Sporus's old identity was gone. He was drilled in feminine behavior, taught to walk, speak, and even laugh like Poppaea. He wore her jewelry and her gowns, turning the act into a second skin. The process didn't just erase his past. It forced him to live as someone else, surrounded by people who all knew the truth, but had to pretend otherwise. The court, always watching, played along with the charade. Advisors, guards, and dinner guests all nodded and smiled, careful not to let their real feelings show. Some did it out of fear. After all, crossing Nero was a death sentence. Others hoped that going along would earn them a reward. Whenever Nero called Sporus Sabina, and shared memories that never happened, everyone acted like it was perfectly normal. The court became a theater, and the only script that mattered was the one Nero wrote. For Sporus, survival meant becoming a master of reading Nero's moods. He learned to spot the warning signs, a certain look, a raised voice, a shift in posture. If Nero was in a good mood, Sporus played the part with extra care. If the emperor was angry, he faded into the background, suddenly busy with embroidery or jewelry. Every word, every gesture, became a calculation. Too much emotion could set Nero off. Too little, and it would be called rebellion. Sporus had to balance on a knife's edge, always performing, never letting his guard down. The psychological toll was heavy. Sporus's life was one long act, and there was no break between scenes. He was surrounded by luxury, but every bit of it was a reminder that he had no freedom. Even in private, he couldn't relax. The people who dressed him, styled his hair, or brought his shoes all knew he was acting, but they played along too. Over time, Sporus grew more withdrawn, his real self shrinking as the role of Sabina took over. Even laughter or small talk felt dangerous. If it didn't match Poppaea's memory, it could bring trouble. Public appearances were the worst. State banquets, festivals, and parades turned Sporus into a spectacle. Rome's elite would stare, some in shock, others with pity, and many with morbid curiosity. The city that loved a scandal now had a new one to whisper about. Sporus became a symbol, proof of how far Nero would go to get what he wanted, no matter the cost. People whispered as he passed, but nobody dared intervene. You might think that all this luxury meant Sporus had it better than most Romans, but the real story was different. The perks came with a price: total loss of freedom, constant surveillance, and the erasure of everything that made him who he was. Every night, he went to bed in rooms meant to impress, dressed as someone he'd never chosen to become, holding on to memories that weren't his. The constant performance wore him down, leaving him a shell of his former self. As Nero's grip on Rome began to slip, the palace atmosphere grew even more tense. Sporus, trapped in his role as Sabina, had to keep up the act while the world around him changed. The danger didn't disappear with Nero's downfall. In fact, it only grew. Sporus's story was far from over, and the next chapter would force him to face choices even more brutal than anything he'd survived so far. When Nero died by suicide in AD 68 after Galba's revolt, you might think that would be the end of Sporus's nightmare. But the fall of the emperor didn't mean freedom for Sporus. Instead, his life became even more unstable. With every shift in power, Sporus was treated less like a person and more like a possession passed around by Rome's new rulers. First, Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect, claimed Sporus as his own. Nymphidius made a point of displaying Sporus in public, calling him Poppaea and parading him as if he had inherited not just Nero's power, but his twisted legacy. Suetonius and Dio Cassius both note that Nymphidius wanted everyone to see he now held the same Empress that Nero had created, showing off Sporus as a symbol of his new authority. There was no escape from the role. Even after Nero was gone, the name Sabina stuck, and Sporus was forced to keep up the act. He was shuffled from one power broker to the next as Rome lurched through the chaos of the year of the 4 emperors. In these months, emperors came and went, and Sporus was dragged along for the ride, never asked what he wanted, never given a chance to disappear. Each new man in charge found a use for him, not as a person, but as a living reminder of imperial scandal and cruelty. At banquets and public events, Sporus was put on display, the curiosity at the center of every room. Senators whispered, guests stared, and nobody pretended for a second that he was anything but a pawn in someone else's game. Things got even worse under Vitellius, who took power after Nymphidius. If you thought Sporus's life couldn't get any more degrading, Vitellius was ready to prove you wrong. He decided to use Sporus as the centerpiece in a public spectacle, one of those entertainments that made Roman crowds cheer and everyone else cringe. Vitellius planned a reenactment of the myth of the rape of Proserpina, with Sporus forced to play the goddess. This wasn't just a play. It was a public humiliation staged for maximum effect, with Sporus set to be paraded and violated in the arena as a warning and a joke. Imagine standing in the middle of a packed amphitheater, knowing that your suffering was about to become the city's entertainment. For Sporus, this was the final straw. After years of being forced into someone else's identity, made to live as Poppaea for Nero, and then for every man who followed, he faced the prospect of being degraded in front of thousands. The threat wasn't just about pain or death. It was about losing the last shred of dignity he had left. Faced with this unbearable future, Sporus made the one choice that was truly his. He chose to end his own life, most likely by poison. This act wasn't just about escaping pain. It was a refusal to let anyone else write the final chapter of his story. For once, Sporus took control, denying Vitellius and the Roman mob the satisfaction of watching him be destroyed for their amusement. In a life defined by other people's power, this was the only act of agency he had left. Ancient historians didn't care much about Sporus as a person. They wrote about him as a symbol, a lesson in what happens when emperors go unchecked, or a footnote in the long list of Roman scandals. Sporus's story became a warning about the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of treating people as playthings. But if you look past the gossip and judgment, you see something else. A person who survived years of erasure, humiliation, and forced transformation, and who, in the end, found a way to say no. His suicide was both a tragedy and a protest, proof that even after everything, some part of the boy he once was still survived. It's easy to focus on the emperors Nero, Vitellius, and all the rest, because their names fill the history books. But the real lesson is in the lives like Sporus's, the ones erased and rewritten by those in power. Sporus's final act wasn't just about ending his suffering. It was about reclaiming a sliver of dignity that no emperor could steal. His life reminds us that behind every legend of imperial Rome, there are real people whose stories deserve to be remembered, not just for what was done to them, but for the small, defiant choices they made when everything else was taken away. And that's what makes Sporus's story matter. Not just as a footnote in some emperor's biography, but as a warning about unchecked power and the cost it demands from those caught in its shadow. Looking at Sporus's last days, it's clear his story didn't end with Nero. After years of being forced into someone else's identity, Sporus faced one final humiliation when Vitellius planned to parade him in the arena. Rather than submit, Sporus took his own life, most likely by poison, in AD 69. Ancient historians like Tacitus saw this as Sporus's last act of agency, choosing death over another round of public degradation. If stories like this make you rethink what power can do, hit like and subscribe for more history that doesn't pull its punches. Drop a comment with other forgotten voices you want us to explore.